Yes, and we are back with another exciting episode, another solo episode of Content Minded. And this time I got something very special. Actually, uh, this episode's been very polarizing, or rather, the response that I've gotten from my audience has been quite polarizing. And I feel it's worthy of me to do a little bit of like an awareness check, right? I mean, we're dealing with, in this topic, some, you know, like meta irony or post ironic humor, which has followed the work of Sam Hyde, throughout his, throughout not just his career, but also, Sam, Nick, and Charles, MDE, the MDE extended universe as well. A lot of my thoughts on Fish Tank come from watching it, but also I remember being in this Schwab space, and Schwab will come on Content Minded one day, where we were talking about the sort of, and I know like using a big theory cell word that's become Redditified because of the various media tropes on the internet, but the liminality of Fish Tank. So before we get into this, please, first time listener, I'm currently in the process of writing a book on art in the 21st century called Neoliberal Kitsch. And it's a concept that I really didn't come up with. I mean, I was inspired to write about because the actual uttering of the phrase came from the book by Thurston Butts Borstein, Deculturation, which is a big influence upon me, as well as John David Ebert's book, Art After Metaphysics. And so, I'm currently writing my book, and I haven't been as much of a content machine when it comes to content-minded and giant reviews, where I have to actually finish reviewing Art After Metaphysics. And I want to do a really big project when I'm done writing my book, where I review all of the Red Book by Carl Jung. But, so a donation, subscription to Patreon, where you can find all of the episodes, all of the full extended, non-censored, controversial, extra content. Each episode has at least an hour of content extra, as well as, depending on the guest, or as much as I can. So you will get full access to everything, and also at higher tiers you will get, cool swag like a mug, some artwork of mine, some artist prints from the That Feel When No GF series of woodcuts that I've done. Trying to juggle everything, and I have neglected my art to write, which I really, a very special, important person in my life has said, like, Gio, you should really focus on art more. And I go, yeah, you're right. She knows who she is. Anyways, so it would really help out. If you don't like that, then all of it is available, of course, on Substack, but I would encourage you to go to Substack, because that's where all my writing will be, all my articles. But every podcast episode in full, the full and the public versions are there. So if you so choose to subscribe for free, then you can switch over. But anyways, enough shilling. Let's get into it. So I wanted to do an episode on Fish Tank. I considered writing a chapter in my book, but I feel that for the type of content that it is, that it would be much better served if I actually just get my thoughts out there. I have a few bullet points that I've written down, and I want to talk about the significance of it. But before I proceed, let me do the disclaimer, okay? And I'll include music breaks and everything in this episode. Let me do the disclaimer. And also, the paid version of this will include a sort of a smorgasbord, if you will, a medley of different topics. I'm going to talk about the current riots in France. I talk about this Terry Davis take that I saw, the Terry Davis account on Twitter, God rest his soul. And I talk about a bunch of other things. What else did I talk about? I talk about like a bunch of other issues related to politics, and maybe a little bit more about Fish Tank, but I'll talk about some spicier stuff. And of course, I'll give you a little update on my view on the current SMO in the Blue Yellow Country, the Special Military Operation, and, after Bidagogin, Wagner went insane. So, but of course I was on the War Report recently, and, me, Gordon, and Constantine, we really hammer into it. That episode did quite well in terms of numbers for them. I said in the episode, I'm like, I treat the war report like it's sort of I can get my geopolitical takes out. It's sort of like the farm team to to the content minded universe. But anyways, and of course the big leagues of the digital archipelago with me and Prudentialist. So a disclaimer would be that I realize what I'm doing here. I realize that everything I say sounds ridiculous in light of just an internet meme show. But that's the trick, though. That's the trick. Is that there's a level of ridiculousness to it. There's a level of it's just a meme. There's a level of it's been done before, and they're doing this like hyper reality internet version of it. But that's the beauty of it, because in this time frame, you can be like an irony bro, an irony leftist. You can be like, you know what? Sam Hyde's humor is just racism and sexism, blah, blah, blah. It's isms, and it's like, it's internet culture. It's terminal chud 4chan brain. That's, your brain's been fried and you should go out and touch grass. But, I've been doing, put it this way. As I've alluded to in the Digital Archipelago, I've been doing some, I can't get into specifics, but I've been doing some pretty good grass touching lately, in terms of my personal life. So I know that this is going to sound kind of ridiculous to really like muster all of the brain cells, all of the galaxy brain word cell takes into like an internet meme show. I understand. Okay, so I'm getting ahead of the controversy of this episode. And so by controversy, I mean that when I propose this idea to my audience to do a full omnibus, a full collection of all of my different ideas that I've somewhat expressed in YouTube shorts, in tweets, in Telegram posts, about Fish Tank when it was going on, right? Those are the plein air sketches before I get to the finished work, if you will, in terms of painting analogy. Then, I was sort of met with polarization because a lot of people were like, well, this is ridiculous, Geo. But then a lot of people were like, yeah, this is interesting how you can turn your theory cell mind into another product that the Sam Hyde Extended Universe has created. And I think that I can't really talk about Fish Tank without talking about the overall influence of Sam Hyde as the quintessence of an internet figure that is not a lolcow, right? Someone who has been a fixture of online culture, whether you agree or not, whether you agree with his politics or not, whether you think that his influence has been negative or positive. Nevertheless, he has been a fixture there, and not just him. You have to factor in Charles and Nick as well. A lot of people so I guess let's get right into it. Let's get right into it. So I know that the controversy is that I'm talking about an internet show that's been done before. It's like a Big Brother spinoff, but it's real. But we'll get into that. And so I'm aware of the fact that I'm really just like, I'm putting all my brain cells together for something that's supposed to be a funny meme. And something that is like a lot of people, and, to touch on another controversy, a lot of people have basically said this is either gross exploitation of people, of socially unaware, mildly neurodivergent Zoomers. But that's the magic of it. You have to risk that exploitation. And so Sam Hyde, his whole career has been about risking exploitation. Right? And I mean, a more accelerated version would be, would obviously be Frank Castle. Right? I mean, I've interviewed Frank Castle. And hopefully Frank Castle listens to this. But, on my previous show on Follow the Rules, I interviewed him. And I think I probably, not to brag, but I mean, I tried to be a bit more nuanced in terms of like what he's doing. And, these type of things are always going to hit into moral quandaries of like, okay, the most uncharitable take is he's just harassing people in public. The most charitable take of Sam is he's just using edgelord internet culture into a medium of, podcasting, stand-up, comedy, skit comedy. But MDE carries with it this nostalgia because it was so integral. And, as much as I bomb on him, as much as I beef with him, as much as I think like, whatever, from one theory cell to another word theory cell. I remember Logo had this take once back when World Peace got canceled, literally and figuratively. And that word cancellation is stupid because I know like a lot of these like left Norwood irony bros, they all say like, you know, the worst thing in the world is like the left does the canceling and the right is like, you know, against cancel culture. It's become a meme. It's become cool. It's become like Daily Wire tier like pundits talking about cancellation. But they were literally canceled over a nonsense thing. MD would have been I predict it would have been as big, if not bigger, than Tim and Eric, right? Than that whole thing. Maybe not as big, but maybe approaching that level of fame / infamy. Because clearly, with MD, and you know, this is my Fire MD take, is that I feel like Tim Heidecker was so threatened by it because it represented an evolution of that Tim and Eric humor. Now, full disclosure, I am not a fan of Tim and Eric. I've watched a few things, but I have my two best friends in real life. They're like super fan Tim and Eric show. You know, they're like super fans. They know every like little stitch of lore. And so I've been exposed to Tim and Eric. And I mean, I've watched a few things here and there, but you know, besides the point, I've watched enough to know the type of humor that is, you know, very millennial, very like random, very ironic, but you know, and not to discredit them, but they've done a great job. They've opened up the floodgates of internet humor that, at least in part, becomes equated with internet culture, even though it is not a part of it, or at least it's maybe impartially inspired by it. You know, again, so if there's a Tim and Eric fans listening to this, I'm not trying to cast shade, but I'm saying that MD represents sort of that jumping off point of that particularly millennial style of humor into something that can broach social commentary, that can be a deep reflection. Of course, one of my favorite MD skit of all time, the one that got me into $1 Million Extreme into Sam Hyde, was Ideas Man. I mean, I could do a whole podcast on Ideas Man myself, but I think that, you know, that's why that was a lot of people in Adult Swim stabbed Sammy and the boys in the back. I mean, it obviously was going to take off, but also the subversive nature of it, even though there wasn't like what blockhead Joe Bernstein accused them of, that there was symbols of the, you know, Hindu symbol of peace, you know, from the mid-century Germans, the painter of Austrians. You know, that was all just nonsense, right? And it didn't help that Sam had an optical, you know, elements to his own personal output. We all know the famous, infamous photo with Weave, you know, at the same time that, you know, anyways. The point being is that it was a jumping off point. And as much as I beef with Logo, as much as I disagree with him, Logo did have a generally good take. He said that, you know, the reason why we have this fixation and this nostalgia and this longing and this lament over $1 Million Extreme World Peace is because that was when people of us made it. I'm not talking about like far-right, E-right Twitter personalities. I'm not talking about like Chud, you know, 4chan, true cell culture. I'm talking about not just dissident, but like subversive, like truly underground internet culture in general. That was a time where we quote unquote made it. And that was really a sucking blow to all of us. Because there will be, in terms of mainstream culture industry productions, that can never be allowed to happen again. And there was a time period where even I was critical of Sam when he first started his podcast, and he, you know, but people didn't get it. And this was what Schwab was saying in the Twitter space. Is that people at the time, like, they criticized him. Like, who are these, like, nerdy guys? These, like, nerdy little Zoomers that are surrounding Sammy, and they're looking at him with, like, big, bright eyes, like the god. And you know, Sam for a time became this, like, cantankerous old man. This, like, you know, the 30s boomer millennial that, like, was trying to impart wisdom to sensitive young men. And people were like, well, he's bitter. He always brings up the fact that he was canceled, that he'll never have a mainstream career. You know, he had a falling out with his previous associates. But you know, Schwab said, and I commented about, like, the liminality of it in this Twitter space about how MD, you know, not just MD World Peace, but Fish Tank represents this sort of, like, reflection of ourselves to ourselves, which we'll get at in this program. But Schwab said, you know, people didn't realize this at the time, but Sammy was collecting sluggers around him that could go off and do their own alt internet culture that can give them the tools to do something else, something greater. And people didn't really realize this at the time, because they were so crestfallen. Like, all of us were so crestfallen to see Sam Hyde become this, like, bitter, cantankerous, like, resentful, like, trying to give advice sort of thing. I remember when Hyde Wars came out, the first time, the podcast Hyde Wars, right? And of course he was spoofing, Tech Wars from Warren and that other guy that I shouldn't mention, but Speaking of Logo de Atlas, right? Anyways, I'm not going to mention the guy's name because I've made a conscious effort not to mention him ever again. But anyways, I remember when those podcasts came out, and there was a shift in tone. There was sincerity. There was anger. There was righteous anger. There was bitterness. But Sam did something brilliant. Did something that people could only dream of, which was to be totally independent, to create a media production company on the internet through the support of fans. And, controversially, a lot of people said that basically Fish Tank was a covert grifting operation. But, the fact that they ran into so many technical problems, and the fact that the previous controversies came home to roost for a little bit in the middle of the show with certain technical difficulties and deplatforming attempts, and the fact that they were crossing legal quandaries. And, Sammy and Jet Neptune, and I will get to Jet Neptune, I will have praise for him, because it really, Fish Tank was his child. They really faced a lot of legal barriers that big media production companies that do put on, like, Big Brother spinoffs, whether it's in different countries. I believe there's, like, Big Brother Australia, Big Brother New Zealand, Big Brother England. I think it was, if I recall, I could be wrong, but Big Brother, the concept of it was actually started in the UK, right? Big Brother, I think there was, Big Brother Canada. Of course, it really took off in America. But, I'll get to the sort of authenticity part, but the point being is that they faced a lot of legal consequences because you were giving something that big Hollywood networks cannot give you, which is authenticity. But the authenticity of, and I'll get to the influences of it, of that social experimentation culture, rather the evolution of it, that is met with a lot of legal consequences because you are essentially messing with people's real lives. And I think that the meme culture that's surrounded, and so the critical part that I will have to begin with, to show that no, I'm not emphatically praising what happened. And I am, of course I am. I'm doing a whole podcast on it. And I desperately, I really am excited to see what happens in season 2. But I think a critical point was that people forgot, because of the internet meme chan culture that Sam Hyde represents, that shrugged off on Fish Tank as a whole, and that people became irreverent to an extreme degree in terms of pouring over the contestants and the freeloaders' personal lives, and the fact that they were unaware of it, at least in part. There was moments where they probably, hooped a cell phone, or when there was a inevitable swatting attempt, they could access social media and see that they were generating a form of online celebritydom and parasociality, which I'll, of course, get into. It's really startling that, you're basically given a window into manipulating people's lives and seeing them tick and having all of those human relations exposed. And so I think I'll have to paywall it for YouTube, but I will talk about the unique time period that this came about. That the world experienced, if you were Canadian, especially like me, the world experienced that sometimes at least 1 to 2 to 3 years of being terminally online, of locking down, of having our sense of geography and our sense of subjectivity violated because the outside influenced the inside of ourselves through the, C-Vidian era. that the awareness of danger, of existential threat, and I know, like, I hate that term because a lot of, like, Norwood, Reddit type philosophy, they use this term like existential threat, existential security, but, it's an apt description. The sort of biopolitical relations of that era have forced everyone into the wired, into the online world, right? And so now when people are totally free, not totally free, but like now that people can actually go outside and touch grass, now we are given a window into the lives of Zoomers on Fish Tank that have been submerged once again, have returned to the interiority of living with people in a shared space because you have no choice. And all of those little frustrations that blow up into huge catfight-like drama, into like high school relations of who's gossiping and who's doing little whisper campaigns. And of course, the fact that the chat can reveal to the contestants when, unless it was integral to the moving on of the show, where, the contestants were informed of it. But then, of course, there is the ambiguity of, is the chat just messing with me? Are they just trolling? And the whole show has a layer of irony and ambiguity, which I'll get into. So yes, this is the controversy of Fish Tank. You are messing with people's lives. And I think that to begin, we have to go to the ending of Fish Tank, which I think was a bit LARPy and a bit like, by the time there was all of these like suggestions that the show couldn't go on because of funding, and there was this ambiguity, and the contestants were put in this like constant turmoil of the show could end and they could get nothing. And yes, it was a little bit LARPy that Sammy did the whole, Jason Goldstriker did the whole, subversion, breaking of the fourth wall by getting really pissed off and, dropping the hard R and like, doing the whole Charlie and the, Willy Wonka type of thing, the meme, right? You get nothing, right? But then what he did at the end, apart from like the whole, like the show could end, but then, the streamer, Dr. Disrespect, what's his name? Dr. Disrespect, like he gave funding to it. It's like, who knows if that was just kayfabe, right? It's all kayfabe. It's all pro wrestling. It's like, oh, the show ended, oh my God, abruptly, but then he brought it back. And then finally, the whole thing with the money, which was, of course, from the very beginning, from the first week, or from the second week, for example, they told Letty that, like, oh, there was a problem with Vance's contract and we have to get rid of him, so you should really do a whisper campaign to try to push him out, because we can't let him win because he could take all of our money. Like, those things cemented this perception that the show couldn't go on, that the contestants were in a constant state of insecurity, the way that we kind of all were just a year prior. That you didn't know when you could go outside again. You didn't know when the restrictions could lift. You didn't know if the thing was, like, the ambiguity of the actual, for YouTube's sake, the illness itself was severe or less severe. I'm not going to name the illness. You know the one. So that replicated in this very contained and confined manner a house filled with socially awkward Zoomers. And so the ending, to start from the end to go to the beginning, when Sam pulled that sort of swerve on people, that Vince Russo-esque WCW swerve in booking, or rather TNA swerve, whatever. When Vince Russo, when he said to people that the show can't go on, and it's because of you people, because you people took it too far, and you're turning online, and how, you people need to go and touch grass, and you're going out there and you're stalking Josie while she's sleeping. Like 200 people or 1,000 people viewing a live stream of someone sleeping. That you have built up this parasociality of donating plushies. That you've bought into the kayfabe. That you're so terminally online that your whole existence is like generated by meme culture. Like, I'm even aware that when he did this reversal, that I'm doing a whole podcast on this thing, on this joke that was extended out into like countless thousands of dollars and like 6 weeks of basically mentally gaslighting impressionable, socially awkward young people. It's like I'm even aware of the fact that I'm talking about it in such a serious or semi-serious way, using all of my brain power to give you these hottest of hot takes on Fish Tank. That Sammy like basically did the swerve and reversed the script and like broke the fourth wall and said that no, all of you people are responsible for this. That's why you'll get nothing. Because all of you people tried to screw things up because you bought into it so much. And that was like, I could kind of predict he was going to do something like that. But it was really like quite something. It was jarring, I remember. The chat was going nuts when you were like watching it on the website. And like then of course the redemptive moment of Josie winning and Letty getting a substantial second place prize. And I will talk about Letty, how she was the main character all along. But, you know, the introduction, let me just say that it was really a jarring moment for a reason, because it really forced us to examine how we engage in the wired, in the online world. It forced us to confront our own capacity to be invested in manipulating the lives of strangers on the internet. And the fact that we can team up together to harvest this interaction through the engagement of the other, and that we can manipulate the other into the image of ourselves. And like there was, you know, super chats where there was like suggestion and trying to like edge them into say on optical things and to make them become a reflection of ourselves. And so Sam Hyde acutely was aware of that. And he picked up on that we are an image of ourselves through Fish Tank. And so let me, before I go, let me into a music break, let me explain this image of ourselves being reflected. Rather, what was made abundantly clear was that the contestants, the way that they were selected, was designed to maximize some, yes, of course, parasociality, and I know that's become a bit of a buzz term, but rather the selection process, as you know, it's pretty evidently clear, was designed to create an identification. They wanted to take the typical phenotype of what an average Zoomer is, with all of their flaws and foibles, and create a deeper sense of reality through that. And I think that's why a lot of people became obsessed and invested very quickly in a lot of these different characters, because it became real in the sense that we are represented. But representation is very funny, because representation, you know, and a lot of my book on neoliberal kitsch talks about this, that representation becomes this cheap, often political signifier. And it's something that is used as the shelling point of all meaning and all identity and the construction of identity. And just one-to-one similitude between your identity as a character, as sort of like a character category, and as a sort of stand-in for what having an honest personality and an honest sense of subjectivity, a sort of self-authenticity. You know, I mean, authenticity in terms of the self is very complicated. I mean, yes, I'm thinking of the Heidegger notion of like, well, authenticity is realizing yourself as Dasein. It's engaging in reality that itself realizes that at least, well, I mean, he gets this, I mean, well, I shouldn't say that Sartre gets it from him, but, Sartre, he, talks about how subjectivity and authenticity, a being for itself, right? Like that is reflected in this ability to realize that, yes, there is an essential game that's happening with social interaction, and bad faith is being the best sort of like category expression. Like use the example of the waiter. That's like the best dang waiter he could ever be. And, he plays that role and that's who he is. Whereas a sense of authenticity, well, in Sartre and in Heidegger is very complicated, but for our purposes, let's just say that you realize that there is a game to social interaction, but, you come to terms with the fact that you, in a sense, create the response to the intertextual nature of reality around you. Like what Heidegger called thrownness. You are thrown into the world, and it's your engagement through care, he calls, or, well, I mean, I guess you could say concern with the world around you. But in this sense, what I mean by authenticity is that they wanted to basically reflect what the generation of, like, Xennial to Zoomer is like. They wanted to take, like, ordinary average people. And the thing is, the criteria for it was that, yes, of course, you could say that some of it was mercenary, because you knew right off the bat that, for example, Josie was going to obviously be a star, in the sense that people, like, a lot of, terminally online, sensitive, lonely, very, very, lonely, sensitive young men, put it that way, that they would find a sort of identification because she has all of the markers. She's indigenous, but she looks kind of Asian. She cosplays. She does art. She's like very like she's a bit well, not a bit. She is neurodivergent and like has these behavioral tics, and you could tell right off the bat, like, this is just like catnip to a certain phenotype of not just Sam's audience, not just MD's audience, but in general, I guess, like, terminal online internet brain. And so all of these characters, like, some of them tried to, like, I would say Mario would be, like, one of them, where they're, like, trying to play a character, but of course they are rejected by the audience. Near the end, when Mario came back and then Frank Hassel hassled him away, right? Because people see the inauthenticity of it. Because what happens is and here's the thing, before we proceed, I want to say, like, in terms of the selection process, the brilliance of Jet Neptune here to gauge the audience. I mean, really, this is his child. I mean, of course, Sam floated the idea. Of course, you could say that the culmination of the influences of various things. Like, I believe, wasn't it Mr. Beast that had, like, where he gave away so much money to someone who stayed in, like, half a house for, like, a summer or something like that? And you have, like, the Hell House idea that Sam Hyde floated in his podcast, I believe in 2021 or even before. Of course, Big Brother. You have various, like, surrealist internet humor type of things. You have this, I would say, visual internet culture that was created out of streaming, particularly IRL streaming. Like, you have streamers like, apparently he's not doing too good lately, but I don't know the deep lore of the current situation, but you have, like, for example, Ice Poseidon would have, like, a segment of time where basically the super chats, or whatever the equivalent is on Twitch, they would determine what he would do in life for, like, a period of time. And so all of these internet influences, of course, IRL streaming is, like, an obvious influence, because you could say that there's crossover with that culture with, like, IP2 IRL streaming and, like, at least nominally, like, MDE adjacent type of things. Not totally, but the connection is there, because the internet connection, in terms of, like, all of these, like, they cross over into a bit of dissident culture. I mean, the obvious example is Baked Alaska. And they sort of have this relation to the audience reflecting real life. Like, wasn't it Asian Andy that would, like, go out there and, like, the text-to-speech, and, we all know what happened with that, right? Like, I think even Andy Milonakis would do some of that as well. And so you have, like, years previous, this notion that the audience can become a part of the spectacle in a much more meaningful way. Not just in streaming culture, but now when you bring that out to real life, quote unquote, to quote unquote meat space, now you have this, like, toxic mix of internet culture bleeding into the real. Which is, what's funny? What really predicted this? I mean, there was probably shows that had more of a, even going back way farther than this. What really predicted this? Because it's really one of the best anime series of all time. Was Serial Experiments Lane. Lane predicted, like, there was this one scene where that one, like, nerdy guy that was a part of The Wired, he was addicted to The Wired. He had this, like, IRL rig that would display reality through the lens of The Wired. And so people talk about VR, and of course, like, he's interacting with normal human beings, but he's also a part of The Wired. visually, audio, so forth. And I think he ends up dying or something like that, if I remember. Or the Wired like fries his, or Lane like fries his brains or something, or rather an avatar of Lane that is of like the computer god, to go all Francis E. Deck, the, global communist computer god. But yeah, so Lane almost like predicted that. You could say that's like a proto form. I even said this in my, me and Prude's Digital Archipelago episode reviewing Serial Experiments Lane, where, it's almost like you imagine Baked Alaska with his, text-to-speech rig, his, like, vest he would put on with all the battery life and, going around and harassing people. And really there's a fundamental disconnect between what, like, the quote-unquote normies experience and what you were experiencing, or what the chat is experiencing with you. And so Fish Tank was really the logical extension of this culture, of this e-culture. Because Fish Tank now creates a contained environment for this, where chaos can be unleashed. And the fact, and I'll talk about the navigation of space and we come back from the music break, but let me just say that there's an intense identification of the self with the self, where we want to see ourselves reflected. Because what happens with reality shows is that these people, then they go on to become reality stars and whatnot, and they're like, flunkies and Z-list celebrities. But there's a sort of crafting there by studio networks, as we all know. I mean, yes, you could say that there was some iterations of Big Brother that actually do stay, sleep over in the studio. But like with the presence of the camera 24/7, apart from when they had technical difficulties and they had to stream on YouTube, the hard camera in the living room. There's what I said on Telegram. And this is why I call this an omnibus, by the way, because I'm gathering all of my different communiques and discourses over Telegram, whether it's in the Digital Archipelago or, on Telegram or in tweets, that, when it comes to the nature of reflecting ourselves, there is an authenticity, or rather there is the pretense of authenticity that MDE and Jet Neptune and the sort of like Sam Hyde universe can give you. And so not only is there this intense identification with $1 Million Extreme being reflections of ourselves going into it, but then Jet Neptune takes that, and now we identify with an image of what we truly are. Or, well, not me, I'm like an old head millennial. But yeah, a bit of it, right? Where, like, these socially awkward neurodivergent Zoomers have to live in a house together, but it's not like the typical confines of an ordinary existence because they can't go outside. They're being harassed and harangued by the chat. They're being gaslit all the time that this thing could end, and that there's no, that at the end of the tunnel there will be no prize money. And it just goes on this way. There's a serial ambiguity to it. The way that during the Savidian era, there was this ambiguity to everything. And I'll talk about the sort of interiority of space in the next chapter of this podcast. But I wanted to, before we go to music break, I wanted to give you a reading of one of my favorite essays ever. And I'm rereading it because, spoiler alert, on Content Minded, Peter Ludlow has agreed to come on the podcast, who, of course, the amazing academic, one of the first pioneers of writing about the internet, who wrote the obituary to Humdog. But one of my favorite pieces of writing is Pandora's Vox by Humdog, the late, great Humdog. And, of course, she was talking about online communities in Pandora's Vox. The subtitle is, Pandora's Vox on communities in cyberspace. One of my favorite lines comes up here. And the reason I bring this up is because she really predicted this. And even the fundamental elements of Fish Tank is that we are reflecting ourselves. Then Sam Hyde at the very end breaks this perception, breaking the fourth wall, but not in like a stupid Reddit way, like a stupid, Marvel, or like not even Marvel, but like the pop culture has abused this postmodern trope of breaking the fourth wall fundamentally. Even in professional wrestling, they do this all the time. It's really stupid and inane and so forth. But what Sam Hyde did was, I think, was I believe I tweeted at the time it was a necessary deconditioning or resensitization to what the reality of Fish Tank was, which is you are luridly manipulating these real flesh and blood human beings in a very strayed social environment that they are thrown into. And yes, they agreed to it. But it's like, I believe it was, who tweeted this? It may have been either Kino Corner or Lo-Fi Republican that tweeted, Fish Tank is kind of like the Stanford Prison Experiment, but instead of Zimbardo, you have Sam Hyde. And instead of the prison guards, you have the audience. Like, that's brilliant, right? But you have like 1,000 or tens of thousands at one point. Prison guards giving you orders, gaslighting you, determining the course of your life through the super chats and through, influencing with fish toys and so forth. And yes, it wasn't as extreme as people thought it was going to be. They turned off the super chats in dramatic moments. Like, there was sort of calmness punctuated the flow of Fish Tank because it had to. Because you couldn't necessarily push them to the nth degree. Although there was a lot of people that were bummed at that because they wanted, like, ultra sadistic, 24/7 gaslighting. They really wanted, like, a Stanford Prison Experiment type of event. And by the way, the Stanford Prison Experiment's total BS. Because not only does it, like, this is a side note, but, like, not only does Zimbardo become, like, a, like, Libby, like, it reinforced this, like, liberal notion of power that, like, people can exploit it. You can even become an abusive tyrant. And it's like, no, first of all, it was junk science to begin with. The methodology of the Stanford Prison Experiment was terrible. And that's why it hasn't been replicated today, because you just couldn't do it, right? Unless you're, like, an internet weirdo like Jet Neptune or Sam Hyde, you couldn't really, like, replicate it in any meaningful scientific way, right? And we know this, like, from various events such as the Fukushima, the Fukushima catastrophe, how people in Japan, well, of course, I mean, very high trust, very homogenous Japanese society. But even in places like Katrina back in 2006, there was a lot of, let's say, low time preference individuals who thought ahead and who were helping other people. And who, like, for example, those British students that were there on vacation during Mardi Gras, I believe it was, and they were protecting women in the stadium, like that, stories like that. So you can't say that this notion of, like, well, people can become tyrants, and that's why we need, like, a managerial state. Or that's why we can't have, like, benevolent authoritarian politics. We have to have this, like, mushy liberal representation, which is itself is a lie because of managerialism, right? We all know this. I mean, the reactionary critique of liberalism. My audience at least knows this. But the Stanford Prison Experiment just, like, totally reinforces this, like, Norwood Reddit version of power, right? Like, I hate to say it, as much as, like, for example, Charles Taylor is a brilliant writer and a brilliant philosopher. His essay that I was, like, forced to read a few times in grad school about Michel Foucault, because, of course, being in Canada, being the preeminent political scientist in Canada, philosopher, he had this, like, he, like, critiqued Michel Foucault from, like, liberal democratic norms, where he's like, well, if there's no outside from power, then it's like, well, like, when you examine it, to say that there's an outside of power in Michel Foucault, similar to Nietzsche, like the will to power, right? To say that there's an outside of biopolitics and power knowledge is sort of like saying that can a fish imagine the outside of water? Can a fish breathe outside of water? Can we exist without breathing? That's, but I don't want to go, that's a tangent and it would take a lot of time to unpack that. But, like, a lot of people that have this thing about, like, the Stanford Prison Experiment, but this is all a side note. I'm getting sidetracked. We are reflected as ourselves. We are reflected in our image. But Sam Hyde brought us to this abrupt awareness of the fact that we are watching ourselves. And we import all of these, like, relations and gossip circles and all of, like, our wishes and the memes and the immediate meme culture. So no longer is this, like, a culture industry apparatus shoving people down your throat. And, like, yes, maybe some reality shows can create meme culture by, like, people referencing them, but it's very inorganic compared to a wholly 100% internet-based show. And that was the brilliance. This is what Jet Neptune saw. in that, in that streaming culture, that the internet can provide the real as opposed to the fabulized. Or rather, the real and the fabulized are coming together. The spectacle can have an air of authenticity because, unlike a network show where you can be given a small window into the lives of people, and so of course social media has transformed this, but still that's like a very limited bandwidth of how you can interact with people that are part of these reality shows, of even social media updates while the show is running. I mean, we all know that the show is filmed beforehand and it's like all of a game and there's an orchestration there. But that's like, typical culture industry cinema verita. Even the filmmaker who invented cinema verita and the Californian family, they made it a film into it. They made a film from the documentary. I believe James Gandolfini was the guy. He even said, like, at the end, he didn't do anything else because even though he birthed such a popular phenomenon in North American, even, European, throughout the world, it's all throughout the world. There's, like, reality shows in Lagos. There's reality shows in China and Japan. There's reality shows in India. There's everywhere. The reality show was birthed by this, like, quest to reflect the real. But I have to look up his name. I forget. But he said at the end, like, you can't provide the real. By the very nature of the camera, you can't. But with the webcam, with the 24-hour live stream, you can get pretty close to approximating the real, which is quite interesting, which is why from the first few days when I started watching Fish Tank, I could see what they were trying to do, which was very interesting. But let me get to Pandora's Box, the quote I want to read. And of course, you could find this on a GitHub page. I happen to have a PDF of all of her work that was gifted to me by default. And but the GitHub link, if you just type in Google Humdog Pandora's Box, maybe I'll provide a link in the description. So she says in the middle here, it is fashionable to suggest that cyberspace is some kind of Isle of the Blessed, where people are free to indulge and express their individuality. I was going to say identity, but individuality. Some people write about cyberspace as though it was a 60s utopia. In reality, this is not true. Major online services like CompuServe and America Online. So yeah, this is pretty dated to say the least. But she essentially predicts social media because she was on these Well servers. The Well was sort of like a proto forum / chat room / like approximating social media, but not there. It was like the nascent stages of social media. So Well censors discourse and so forth, but this is the clencher here. Western society has a problem with appearance and reality. It keeps wanting to split them off from each other, appearance and reality. Make one more real than the other. Invest one with more meaning than the other. Then it does the other. There are two people who have something to say about this, Nietzsche and Baudrillard. I invoke their names in case somebody thinks I made this up. Nietzsche thinks that the conflict over these ideas cannot be resolved. Baudrillard, on the other hand, thinks it was resolved, and that is how come some people think that communities can be virtual. We prefer simulation, simulacra, to the real, to reality. So I believe she was referring to, when it comes to Nietzsche, about how, like, ideas cannot be resolved because they're fundamentally perspectival, and it's part of this sort of epiphenomenon of the subject to integrate one's own environment and to use one's own will to power to sort of create a greater apparatus for one's ideas and perspective, right? And of course, like, Zarathustra was sort of like the quasi naturally spiritual, secularly, spiritualized or naturalized version of, his thought in, like, the genealogy of morals and other places. So, yeah, but that's a side note. Baudrillard thinks that it was resolved, and that this is how come some people think that communities can be virtual. We prefer simulation, simulacra, to reality. Image and simulacra extend tremendous power upon culture. Right? That's also the basis of the book I'm writing as well. But It is the tension that informs all the debates about real and not real that infect cyberspace with regrets in regards to identity, relationship, gender, discourse, and community. Almost every discussion in cyberspace about cyberspace boils down to some sort of debate about truth and packaging. What is the truth of one's identity, right? What is the truth of one's own sense of being in the online world? This becomes in some weird ways democratized. We can even, and so Fish Tank takes this like weird course where we can examine in real time the negotiation of people's lives in an apparatus of cyberspace, where the internet is like is a disembodied voice of a disembodied robotic voice of God that is like gaslighting you and telling you stupid memes and coal and so forth, right? But that's an extreme example of this. But here is what the quote that I really wanted to get to. Cyberspace is mostly a silent place. In its silence, it shows itself to be an expression of the mass. Right? The mass? The super chats? One might question the idea of silence in a place where millions of users and user IDs parade around like angels of light, looking to see whom they might, so to speak, consume. You are consuming it. So she intuited the Twitch streamer, she intuited the influencer, she intuited what I'm doing right now, which is podcasting. You are buying the subjectivity of others. You are investing in them. But now that silence gets turned into a monotone, singular voice, the super chat is ultimately democratized. I mean, they would censor it, right? They would like take out like the more ridiculous ones. But the point being is that it is a free-flowing id of the internet, of people that are participating in a medium that combines all of their voices into one. I believe in Hinduism they have, Shiva speaks at the same time with 1,000 voices that come into one in this like Leviathan, mutually arising existence. So yeah, it's like sort of the faces of Janus type of thing. So the silence is placed where millions of users float around like angels of light consuming, so to speak, to consume other people, other avatars, other content that is generated by the subjectivity of another, the character of the other. The silence is nevertheless present and is most present, paradoxically, at the moment that the user ID speaks. When the user ID posts onto a board, it does so while dwelling within an illusion that no one is present. Language in cyberspace is a frozen landscape. But then social media takes this to an nth degree. But what happens when that silence now speaks? What happens when you inflict real life, quote unquote, with the machinations of the internet? Now, sometimes you can create what I think could be like brilliant performance art, which, I mean, it's kind of like I said in the beginning, it's sort of weird and strange and cringe to be so sincere about internet memes. But I do think it's a piece of brilliant performance art, even though it's become memeified and it's maybe not as been, that probably wasn't Jet Neptune's intention. But I still think that performance is something that is so deterritorialized in our day and age that, internet spectacles can be manipulated or can take up a meaning that approximates something like an aesthetic or artistic performance. And I think that there's a pertinence to that. There's a salience to that. Even though we know it's like, it's cringe meme culture. It's just like putting weird neurodivergent Zoomers in a room together, in a house together for an nth period of time and seeing them crack, right? Like it's a spectacle. It's like a theater of the cruel and the absurd, right? But there is something more to that. Why do we have this need to create this theater of the absurd? So it's a frozen landscape, but now you're doing a thing where you are taking those 1,000 voices, putting them through the super chat filter, and turning them into one. So then she says, I have seen many people spill their guts online, and so did I myself, until at last I began to see that I had commodified myself, right? And this was way before dataism that Byung-Chul Han talks about. that corporations can mine data and it becomes a resource. And you yourself are transformed into a series of data outputs. Corporations were not this sophisticated back in 1995 in terms of collecting internet data, and the impermeable God that is the algorithm can reflect your own wishes and desires or intuit them to you through targeted advertising. It's almost like when people talk about that phenomenon, it's almost like they're referring to a strange metaphysical phenomenon. But really, I mean, we could say that, like, materialistically, yes, it's algorithms and so forth, and really it's just intuiting based off of, you know, the data that you're feeding the algorithm or the AI program as to, like, what people with this amalgamation of consumer choices, you know, what they're, you know, it intuits their future desires. But think of that, an impermanent, like, sorry, not impermanent, a impersonal algorithm can determine your future desires. So there's this feedback loop where you yourself desire, and your desires are molded by that algorithm, or a series of algorithms, and then you yourself feed back into the algorithm that tainted information about yourself. Right? Like, when we think of that there's a fundamental disconnect in something, you know, as common but yet as important as economic activity via consumption, because literally consumption, like, you know, the leftoids are the Marxists are kind of right about this, that consumption is the primary vector of all subjectivity nowadays, that even you consume identities, that when you think of it, there's a fundamental distortion there based off of an outside, to use, like, you know, Nick Land acceleration language. The outside that is that digital apparatus of an algorithm determining who you are in a very weird way that you consent to, but you kind of don't consent to. Right? So, I mean, I'm getting off the topic of Fish Tank, but I think it's opening up a greater discussion about what life is like in the digital age. So, commodification means that you turn something into a product which has money value. In the 19th century, commodities were made in factories, which Karl Marx called means of production. Capitalists were people who own the means of production. I mean, this, and she says, like, this is all away now, because now we all become, like, owners of the means of production in some sense. The means that I sell my soul, like a tennis shoe, that I derive no profit from the sale of my soul, my information. People who post frequently on boards appear to know that they have factory equipment. You become inframed. To quote Heidegger. You are that thing that is consumed. You are standing reserve. You are part of a collection and an amalgamation of data that can determine the course of, like, whatever, not just corporate ad campaign, but whatever government program is happening. Geopolitics are like this. I'm sure the war in Ukraine is, like, being, you know, was vigorously, you know, test grouped by the response of the American people in particular, right? Like, you know, like, this is, not to say there's conspiracies in terms of why the SMO was conducted, but I'm just saying that they primed people. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why the whole, like, Russophobia thing took off. But anyways, that's just, like, one example. I believe it was Obama during, I mean, we know that, like, Obama, people blame Trump, but Obama, you know, one big ass mistake, America, right? I love those boomerisms when it came to insulting Barack Obama. But, you know, we know that he was the first cyber president. He was the first president where cyberspace had taken off. You could say that Bill Clinton was like that, because, like, Bill Clinton was the first, like, you know, president that at least was aware of, like, the presidency that was aware of, like, the growing power of the internet. And then during the Bush administration, a lot of those anti-war protests were coordinated by the internet. But Obama, like, you know, the whole thing that people freaked out about Trump and Cambridge Analytica, like, Obama, like, bragged about it. So presidential politics, which is really, in this day and age, world politics, because of the internet, and Trump was the master of this even more than Obama, is, like, engineering the spectacle of the American election on a global stage, because it's the global empire, the global non-empire that doesn't act like an empire. But that's another extreme topic for another time. The point being is that Obama really utilized and bragged about the fact that he was harvesting data from the internet, and that his presidency, I believe, was broadcast to, like, 1,000 different social media groups or whatnot. And so, like, when people freaked out about Trump doing it, it was, like, really just, like, the hypocrisy of the lying, these like, liars in the media. But that's beside the point. It feeds into everything, right? Corporations that own the board was posting too. So the factory equipment and tennis shoes, and sometimes trade sends and emails about how their contributions are not appreciated by management. As if this were not enough, all of my words were made immortal by means of tape backups. I mean, hey, Humdog unfortunately passed in 2004, but was it 2008? Yes, 2008. And so we're like reading it now, right? So my words were made immortal by tape backups. Furthermore, I was paying $2 an hour for the privilege of commodifying and exposing myself. Worse still, I was subjecting myself to the possibility of scrutiny by such friendly folks as the FBI. They can and have downloaded pretty much whatever they damn well please. So yeah, we know this. So rhetoric in cyberspace is liberation speak. The reality is that cyberspace is an increasingly efficient tool of surveillance, which people have voluntarily have a voluntary relationship. A participatory panopticon, in other words. But now we can dramatize that. That's what Fishtank did. It dramatized that panoptical gaze of the audience, of the other, of you, viewing, super chatting, paying for fish toys and so forth. All right, let's take a little bit of a break, and then I'll see you on the other side. And we are back. That was some great music by Philip Daniel, who does all of the music for Content Minded and Generate Reviews. And he is a great friend and patron. I will drop his Patreon link in the description. But that was from a YouTube short, which is really funny. I like the idea of putting music on YouTube shorts or putting art. I've seen people do artwork on shorts, and I will start to do that. I really should just go to TikTok. I mean, I noticed that YouTube has really, maybe it's because I'm consuming more shorts, but I noticed that YouTube's really pushing shorts. So I like those brief philosophic reflections. I wish it had more of the ability to edit background. I guess I could do it the hard way, through Shotcut. But I noticed that they have more of an ability to, in TikTok to edit photos in the background and everything. I've yet to cross that line. I don't know. I'm scared I'd probably get nuked there, but maybe not. But I do like YouTube Shorts. I like those, if people have been following me, those brief moments of reflection. Anyways, getting back to Fishtank, I'm recording this on the 4th of July, so happy birthday to all of my American friends. And Fishtank is really, I think it comes down to a way of navigating, or it was a way of navigating the sort of spectacle nature of meme culture, of the digital swarm, to quote Byung-Chul Han. And even though it's just basically an amalgamation of different memes coming together in this project that, really capture people's attention, I think the fact that it experienced a sort of duration. I remember the feeling of how you could dip in and out into different rooms. I think even Sam Hyde said this on the stream directly after Fishtank, how there was moments where, when the Fishtank was full, when it had contestants and it had, freeloaders, you could dip in and out, if, you wanted to see John and Jason Goldstriker, boxing in the garage, or you wanted to see Letty, scheming and so forth. And I guess I will talk about Letty a little bit, because she truly is the star. She was the star of the show, even more than Josie. And people could follow around characters. I remember following around like different cameras just to see what was happening. Like when they had the whole thing, and I think people don't realize the surrealism of Fish Tank. So okay, let's talk about locality and location and dwelling. And it's part and parcel of sort of like the I know, like, listen, I know how I sound. This is like terminal art world, like word seldom, right? I know this is like totally like, oh my god, you're making a big deal about nothing. You're making a big deal over memes. So I know how this sounds, but there was almost like a relational aesthetics when it comes to the navigation of space in this very like moderately sized house with different rooms, and how each contestant, you could follow their arc by like literally stalking them with the different webcams in the different rooms. And I remember patching in and like trying to follow different characters. And for some reason, I found myself more gravitated to Letty than like say Josie or John or whoever, because Letty would always be gossiping when she was alone in her room. And the significance of room 2 was also something, how room 2... Okay, I'll go from the beginning to the end of Fish Tank. So you could follow characters in different rooms. So like Sam Hyde was saying that, you could see Gold Striker and John boxing if that was your thing. Or you could go to the living room, and most people gravitated towards like the kitchen and the living room for obvious reasons. And you could sort of follow these story arcs. And it was there in a living sense because it was a live stream. And you could access them at different moments. And you'd have people that were up, they'd be gossiping, and they would, then other people would be sleeping. And so it's like they were dropping in and dropping out. And so you could really feel the energies and the intensities of different rooms and different locations. There was someone that, I forget which clip channel, but not like clip channel, clip poster of Fish Tank on Twitter, did a compilation of how the Fish Tank looked before and after. So like when it was pristine conditions in the very beginning, you see like they were just kind of bored, I believe Vance was piddling around with his drum practice board, and like people were just like getting to know each other. And then in the middle and the end, you have what looked like a complete demilitarized zone. You have, I remember tweeting, it was during the camping simulator challenge, where it was like Josie in a pile of rubble. And I believe like Chris was there. Was Chris there? Yeah. And like, they were piddling around, and it literally worked. It literally looked like one of those like third world countries that have like the garbage streams where people are like going around and scavenging in a landfill. It's like, it just evoked the imagery of that. So it was very like surreal to see the development of Fish Tank, how they utterly just trashed this house because of course it fueled drama. And then when when Sam Hyde unleashed Frank Castle upon the Fish Tank, it was crazy. It was crazy. And of course, like, one of the most tender moments of Fish Tank was the aftermath of Simmons, when they kicked him out, when they discovered his stuff I can't say on YouTube type of content he was publishing. You had the moment where they sort of came together in the end there, and like Jet like gave them the respect of turning off the cameras, and they threw out Simmons's bed, and it was really like you could feel that moment, even though it was relatively early in to Fish Tank Live. And so you do have those moments, but the surrealism of it is like they're living in filth, they're throwing bodily fluids on each other, they're doing these challenges what amounts to psychological pressuring, and there was a sense that it was all fly by night, that they were just doing, especially when it came down to Josie and Letty in the cell number 2, where you had to just basically live in room 2. And I think room 2 became significant because if I recall, it was the room that was direct to the staircase. But room 2 took a significance. Someone actually did another sped up compilation of room 2 that I saw on Twitter. And a lot of significant moments happened in room 2. I think it's because originally it was not Josie's room. It was originally Letty, for some reason, gravitated there. Well, Letty moved there in the first week because Letty was in the main room that then became like a haven of freeloaders, room 4, if I recall. That bedroom became, Chris was in there, Airsoft Fatty. But, room 2 took on this significance for a variety of reasons. A lot of, like, key events happened there. And someone did a compilation of all the movements that happened in room 2 and in the living room. And you could really see the transformation of it. I believe that was also the cell when they did not mental health, the illness challenge, where, like, Letty was taped up and Vance was pretending to be a psych ward patient. And he did a brilliant job of it, really. He, like, really replicated, at least in part, the stereotypes of, like, what a mentally ill person in an institution goes through. It really did look like a scene from Bedlam. And the whole fish tank just evolved into, like, this. I mean, imagine the smell. There was that one scene I remember that was, I even said this on Twitter, how surreal it was, where Letty was goaded by Ben. And Ben coming in and gaslighting all of the characters was really funny. But then you had Simon that would, like, call him out, which was also funny. But Ben, like, goading Letty into destroying John's Bible. And John, like, and just ruining the dryer. So John would take clumps of gray matter, of pulp, from his Bible. Because, those, like, very thin, pulpy newsprint Bible pages. And would, like, throw them at Letty. Because you couldn't, like, physically assault people. I mean, there was a slap contest, but that was different. Like, that probably doesn't break, because it was consensual, so it probably doesn't break any rules, any sort of lawsuit type of lawfare type of stuff. But John is, like, throwing them at Letty, and it's like, oh my god, this could be in, like, an art house, like, French New Wave art house cinema type of stuff. This could almost be Lynchian, where you're throwing pulped up Bible clumps at a person and like, John going crazy. But one thing I noticed was when people, like, even though it was 6 weeks, it created this instant sense of nostalgia, which most things, nowadays. It's funny because before this, I did which will be available on this channel, I did a Twitter space with a follower of mine, Volpes, who is also a patron. We did a Twitter space on The Scent of Time by Byung-Chul Han. And he talks about how, like, he almost intuits, like, the serialization of all media. That we can only go back within that franchise. We can only have, like, do you remember when this character... Oh, and this character's coming back. And it's, like, this never-ending, ongoing thing with spin-offs. Because nothing can end nowadays. Because there is no significant amount of gravity to time, to even media depictions. It has to go on forever. Because we're so bereft of significant moments that punctuate time, that even our media reflects it. So, and I knew this. I knew when this was happening, where they would bring back contestants who were popular as freeloaders. They brought back John. They brought back Mario. Too bad they didn't bring back Sylvia, but it was funny because I knew it wasn't going to work. Because they were hemming it up. Because they were aware of the discourse outside of Fish Tank. They were exposed to the social media and the memes. And so there was automatically, very, very quickly, there was this meme mythology brought up around John in particular. But then the second time he comes back, and this could just be my perception, he became, like, annoying, and it wasn't the same, and people really didn't like it because he was playing a character. Whereas John, when he tapped out, I don't believe he was eliminated. They let him go because he was having essentially an ongoing mental breakdown. When John came back, he was, like, trying to play, like, this Andrew Tate LARP and this, like, holier-than-thou religious thing. And it really wasn't authentic. Oh, another point of surrealism was when, Sylvia, they were in the cell number 1. This was the first cell challenge in room 2. where John was, he has this boombox microphone and he's railing off Bible verses at random. And there's all these like, the super chat is playing these like distracting audio clips of like a mass fun posting that happens in a school, or angry Chinese man, or like different, varieties of sounds and meme images. And, they're really memeing on them. And like, basically Sylvia cracked by going out of the room, even after Letty like was, micturating in the closet, to use a Big Lebowski term. And John is like preaching Bible verses, and that's when Sylvia just snaps, like, I can't take it anymore. And so this like weirdo, like preacher Southern Gothic meets surrealism cinema moment. It was quite funny, but in a very disturbing way. But then when John came back, it's like sort of the magic was gone. The mythology of John Tent was over because it became too self-aware. And so I think I knew that was going to happen, because it was subject to the same sort of, marvelification or serialization of all media that you have in like big budget Hollywood, produced Big Brother type of reality shows, where it's like the old characters come back. I believe even Survivor does this. Survivor is like pro wrestling. It's very funny that John Morrison won a season of Survivor, because everyone knows that Survivor's fake, right? Like, it's basically just pro wrestling. Same with Bear Grylls, compared to a good old Canadian boy, Lee Stroud, right? Survivor man. But anyways, yeah, so it ruined the magic. Same with Mario. Mario would come back, and it really was the content outside of the fish tank where he was beefing on like live streams and on Twitter Spaces with Frank Hassel. And it was like, it became too conscious. But I wanted to talk about the space of Fish Tank, how it was told, like, it was reduced to just rubble. And it was funny how, like, the rearrangement of elements, how, the Fish Tank was full of life in a sense in the first few weeks. But then as time goes on, it's like it empties, and by the time you whittle down all the way to Josie and Letty, I remember feeling this strange sense of emptiness in a way, of unoccupancy. There was just, Chris hanging around, and then they brought that other fat guy. And it was a strange sensation. It's like the life of the fish tank had been sucked out. And now there was just like whittling away to the inevitable conclusion that Josie was going to win. And I think that, really people, I said this from very early on. I said this in YouTube comments and elsewhere, that Letty, whether you like it or not, was the main character. That Letty was the source of most drama. Letty was the source from the very beginning of happenings within the fish tank. That Letty, like, worked her, like, higher IQ points, as a neat femcel. Well, I shouldn't say femcel. She wasn't a femcel. But, like, because, but yeah, I guess femcel coded, because femcels are different. And unlike the incel, the femcel can have relations of a physical variety and still be, femcel coded, right? Go to my good friend 4 Hour Life on Twitter to get all of the latest hot takes on the femcels. He's quite a good poster. What's his at? I believe it's just 4 Hour Life. Wow, he got suspended recently. Hopefully he comes back. He was a great poster. But anyways, Letty, she was the source of all drama, I think, for a reason. She was very good at manipulating people, and she was very good at fulfilling the role of the attainable, like, mid-girl. Josie fulfilled the role of, like, Twitch streamer aesthetic type of, like, kawaii streamer anime girl with, like, her cutesy plushies, and it became, like, this weird, like, direct parasociality. Whereas, like, with Letty, you have more of, like, and of course, like, Sylvia is, like, the goth chick, right, But, of course, with Letty, like, the goth punk alternative woman, whereas, like, with Letty, you have this weird mix of attainability, but also, like, this inherently vixen nature to her that I think really drew a lot of like the audience, these like predominantly male, I mean, I don't want to go in the stereotypes of like shut in, incel, blah, 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 but there really was something there. And, they had like the doubles, like Vance had Lance. And of course, Betty was like even more of an intensification of Letty. She was, she, well, that actually blew up on their face because apparently, she was, you know, she was like going really crazy, accusing the whole fish tank crew of things. I quite liked, what was her name, Ellie. I wish she had more of a role, but then she was sort of like the kind of like the addicted art hoe type of villain. That was quite funny. You know what's funny? I had this take. There was video where like Jet was filming Chris cooking one of his like meat salad things, and they're all sitting there like around the kitchen table, and they're all kind of like like Zoomers have this like some Zoomers have like this weird quality where they're like coded as children forever. I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a grizzled old, core millennial. But it was like weird, like Jet was like the parent filming his children. It's like they were sitting around the school table. And it's like, I don't know, they look like little kids. Because of course they act like little kids. It was funny. You can still find that video on YouTube, I feel. I think, yeah. You can still find the video on YouTube where like Chris is cooking some monstrosity. And like Ellie and Betty, Ellie and Letty and Sylvia are sitting around the table. It's like they look like kids. But anyways. It's very funny, like the navigation of space in such a unique environment, how they, random people did grow into sort of like a very dysfunctional yet somewhat harmonious environment. Ecology, where they like sort of grew into this space. And it's very funny how we got to witness their lives, or a segment of their lives, and they were totally exposed. Like even in the live stream afterwards, Letty said that she was in the hotel room and like she was changing. It's like, oh my God, but she's like, no, I'm not in the fish tank anymore. And it must have been very crazy to have that awareness of an audience all the time, to sort of live your life and all of your foibles and all of your flaws and all of those little petty resentments that grow in a mutual space, or cultivate, or should I say fester in a mutual space that was played out in real time. And if you want to get really theory-cellish, let me read you a passage from The Production of Space by Henry Lefebvre and the Marxist theorist, because he's talking about the intersection of spaces and ideas and how this sort of like notion of a space grows together. So this is from page 27 of The Production of Space. It is true that social space is a social product. How is the fact concealed? The answer is by a double illusion, each side of which refers back to the other, reinforces the other, and hides behind the other. These two aspects are the illusions of transparency on the one hand and the illusion of opacity, or the realistic illusion on the other. 1. The illusion of transparency. Here space appears as luminous, as intelligible, giving actions free rein. Right? So we were given, which is the paradoxical nature of Fish Tank, we're given this view into an intimate space of a dwelling, of a house, but now the dwelling is invaded, becomes public. Kind of like the Cividian era, people's own houses were always given this sort of omnipresent violation of the outside, of the constant concern with the outside coming in the form of, viral pathology. But anyways, this is different. This is like directly, being exposed on a constant basis by virtue of the internet. And this sort of like intimate space being violated with all of the permeations of internet meme culture and navigating the space and the creation of content. How content itself can be the vector of violating space. And how that was very funny how, you could see these, intimate lives of these random people being played out. People that are just like you, by the way. As given action theory, what happens in spaces lends miraculous quality to thought. What becomes incarnate by means of a design, in both sense of the word, the design serves as a mediator, instead of a great itself of a great fidelity. Between mental activity, invention, and social activity, realization, and it's deployed in space. The illusion of transparency goes hand in hand with a view of space as innocent, as free of tarps or secret places or traps. Anything hidden or dissimulated, and hence dangerous, is antagonistic to transparency, under whose reign everything can take in by a single glance from the mental eye which illuminates whatever it contemplates. Comprehension is thus supported, or supposed, without meeting any insurmountable obstacles. To conduct what is perceived, i.e. the object, or its object, from the shadow into the light. It is supposed to effect this displacement of the object either by perceiving it with a ray or by converting it, after certain precautions have been taken, from a murky to a luminous state. Hence a rough coincidence is assumed to exist between social spaces on the one hand and mental space, the topological space of thought and utterance on the other. By what path, by means of what magic, is thus thought to come about? The presumption is that the encrypted reality becomes readily decipherable thanks to the invention or intervention first of speech and thus of writing. But now, of course, media creates, a view of mental space. What justification is there for thus claiming that with the spatial realm, the known and the transparent are one and the same thing? The fact is that this claim is a basic postulate of a diffuse ideology which dates back to the classical philosophy. Closely bound up with Western culture, this ideology stresses speech and overemphasizes the written word to the detriment of a social practice which is indeed designed to conceal. This fetishism of the spoken word or ideology of speech is reinforced by the fetishism and ideology of writing. For some, whether explicitly or implicitly, speech achieves a total clarity of communication. The realistic illusion, this illusion of natural simplicity, the production of a naive attitude long ago rejected by philosophers and theorists of language on various grounds and under various names, but chiefly because of its appeal to naturalness, to substantiality. So the illusion of transparency turns out, to revert for a moment to the old terminology of the philosophers, to be a transcendental illusion, a trap operating on the basis of its own quasi-magical powers. But by the same token referred back immediately to the other traps which are to its alibi, its masks. Such the assumption of the ideology which purports the transparency of space identifies knowledge insofar information and communication. It was on the basis of the ideology that people believed for quite a time that a revolutionary social transformation could be brought about by the means of communication alone. Everything must be said. No time limit on speech. Everything must be written. Writing transforms language. Writing transforms language. Therefore, writing transforms society. Of course, we know this is not the case. But I'll relate it back. So, what Lefebvre is saying is that there's this connection between mental space and physical space, and how so here he says on the next page, the illusion of substantiality, naturalness, and spatial opacity nurtures its own mythology. I'm thinking of the space-orientated artists at work in a hand or dense reality delivered directly from the domain of Mother Nature, more likely a sculptor than a painter, an architect sooner than a musician or a poet. Such an artist tends to work with the materials that resist or evade his efforts. When space is not being overseen by the geometer, it is liable to take on physical qualities and properties of the earth. The illusion of transparency has a kinship with the philosophic idealism. The realistic illusion is closer to naturalistic materialism. Yet the two illusions do not enter into analogous antagonism with each other after breaking the fashion of philosophic systems, which armor themselves like battleships and seek to destroy one another. On the contrary, each illusion embodies and nourishes the other. The shifting back and forth between the two and the flickering or oscillating effect that it produces, and thus important as either the illusions considered in isolation. Symbolisms derived from nature can obscure the rational lucidity which the West has inherited from its history and from the successful domination of nature. The apparatus of translucency takes on by the obscure historical and political forces in decline. The state nationalism can enlist images have their source in the earth or in nature, in paternity or in maternity. The rational is less naturalized, while nature cloaks itself in the nostalgias which supplant rationality. So what he's pointing to is essentially space becomes fully transparent. Even the mysteries of nature becomes transparent. We have this quest to make totally seen and exposed all spaces, including the mental space. So even when like a location takes on a significance, there is like this weird intellectualization that goes on of trying to explain those little memories that are evoked by space. Trying to explain totally the exposure of space. So, like, okay, how does this relate to fishing? So what he's saying is that, this is what Mark Ogg called the non-place, or rather the non-dwelling, where, like, the world is surrounded by non-places. The world is surrounded by open spaces that are designed to have this maximum flowing, that don't have this, like, cultural detachment, or what Heidegger calls dwelling. But when we're given a view of, like, on a 24/7 basis, we're given a venue, a look into intimate spaces. We're also given at the same time the mental space of each of these contestants or characters that are occupying this space. And so everything is rendered transparent. And now this becomes a spectacle of transparency. That's what Fish Tank is. That's a good term for it, actually, a spectacle of transparency, where the intimate lives of people are fundamentally transformed by this never-ending apparatus of surveillance from the outside. It's participatory, it's voluntary. But, there were moments, maybe we're just making too much of this. But it is funny how this sort of, like, communal dorm living, there's many people that live like this. And it's in some ways, well, at least maybe to the Western world, depending where in the West, but especially in North America, it's sort of like that kind of communal living is like sort of alien to people. Like there's a lot of these inner kitty squats that have like weird social dynamics, a lot of like rural communities and cults and so forth. You could go down the list, right? They're havens for abuse for, a reason. But it's very funny, like all the challenges, like the fact that the whole environment did have that ambiguity of it, in terms of how it was going to even exist still and so forth. It was quite funny. But to reiterate this point from Lefebvre about ideas and space, let me find the chapter again. It's funny. So the sort of like transparency of it, of like rendering an intimate space transparent, is quite an interesting idea. And I think it's not only do we have like a lurid fascination with it, but the way that we think about social spaces as having a delineation between like what is a social space and what is a public space is sort of like becoming more and more fictitious. Or they become extreme, or even private spaces, because of digital technology and communicative media and social media, is replicating the forces of the outside. And in a strange way, and again, like Byung-Chul Han talks about this, there is no separation anymore, because the way that you arrange yourself, the way that you arrange the dwelling that you are in, the way that you spend most of your time consuming media, like all of that, that is something that is essentially being determined beyond the traditional confines of community and culture and ethnos and religion, things that did shape the lives of people, right? I had this article many years ago about how the Zoomers, not many, a few, back in like 2018, how like younger people, and by that time the Zoomers were, I believe, still in high school, the older ones anyways. I said that, people don't decorate their rooms anymore because their lives are plastered on virtual walls of the internet, of social media. That itself is becoming more increasingly regimented and corralled, and only the expression is on very minute templates that are becoming the same. The mode of communication is the same. Like, TikTok, YouTube has shorts, Instagram has reels, whereas back in the day, like even back in the MySpace days, the profile was something that truly was expressive. But anyways, yeah, so the room becomes barren. You become this, the internet is in a way a constant pipeline to the outside while still being within a space of dwelling. But what's funny is that with Fish Tank, what was very interesting is that the fact that young people now, and I guess I was one of the first generation, well, not really, I mean, the boomers of the TV generation, but in terms of constant need of entertainment, it's like what David Foster Wallace said. He's like, in that, that interview he did for TV France, I think it was, or a French television station, and he's in a hotel room, he's in that green shirt, and David Foster Wallace is like, an environment, a democracy in which you're constantly entertained, that becomes the main mode of everything. It becomes the main mode of culture, the main mode of politics, even, to never let it cease. He goes, a society, and a democracy where we're constantly entertained. He's like, well, that's really, that's almost like hell. Why do we demand to be constantly entertained? But what's interesting is that, he said this back in, the early 90s, or I believe it was, the early 90s, early 2000s. And when you think of it, that's the way society has really been shaped, especially for younger people, is this need to be constantly entertained. But when you do put them in an environment in which those, that constant reality is disrupted, to go 6 weeks without, entertainment or music, I believe the only source of media, besides the super chats that they had, besides, the times where, the swatting or whatever, when they could access social media, I think, the only time they had access to media was, some meme thing, it was, Stuart Little 2, something like that in the TV. And so, to, place, a situation in which young people do not have, at least in, the Western world, do not have constant access to media is almost like hell. It's almost and so you could see that they had to, find sources of identification, and usually it breaks down, or rather it broke down in this case, past tense, into, a high school dynamic. And of course the challenges kept them busy. But you gotta realize, Fish Tank was interesting in that it was uninteresting. It was kind of like an art gallery. It was kind of like a performance piece where the artist would stay in a place for a significant amount of time. It kind of was like a relational aesthetics thing. Because Fish Tank, people were like, well, it's boring, and this is, it's stupid. And yes, it was boring, but the thing is, though, there were moments of incredible boredom that were punctuated by moments of, utter drama and chaos and tomfoolery. And, then, the first few weeks, Jason Goldstriker would come in and, destroy things, and there was, this fundamental, irreverence for the living conditions of people. And, that all these contestants were, they were trying to clean, but then, of course, some were better than others. I believe Letty was the worst one, but, and by the end, they were just, wearing the same clothes, and they were living in filth, and they, it was, it was really a sort of, it was sort of was all those cases. I mean, I don't know how much I could say on YouTube. Those cases of when people are kidnapped and they're forced to live in a house, that one. I watched the Dr. Phil interview with that one woman that was captured by what was that guy's name, Castro something, and yeah, it's it really was this sort of living in filth. But besides that, like, there was moments of intense boredom where they were just doing nothing. And what's really interesting is that to younger people, to do nothing, I mean, yes, we all are doing, like, in a higher level, in a higher sense, we are doing advanced forms of nothingness. We are amusing ourselves to death. We are doing what did Ted K call it, God rest his soul? Pseudo events or pseudo activities, where it's like we are basically doing nothing, but they are masked as like achievement. Social media is like this. Gaming is kind of like that, although I shouldn't insult gamers. But, it's like, even like jobs, even like, again, another guy, God rest his soul, David Graeber, he had that book, BS Jobs, Even that is sort of like, it's amazing how much we place emphasis on pseudo events and pseudo activities. There was another term for it, not just pseudo activities, but surrogate activities, where like activities that are designed to look like something, but really they're just mimicking something else, or they don't really matter. And Ted Kaczynski, he said like basically any act that is outside of the realm of immediate survival, you could easily see how the creation of surrogate activities is the backbone and the engine of so many aspects of modernity. Consumer capitalism. I mean, yes, the Marxists, I know they're flawed, but like the labor theory of value is bunk. But like when it comes to the primary vector of society, capital really is it, right? And consumerism is the mode, like consumption is the mode. And so this is what, to go back to Lefebvre, when it comes to idea space, grafting onto physical space, that was a very interesting inversion of the lives of the average Zoomer in Fish Tank, which is to not consume, to become the product, to become the object of the gaze. But in order to do that, they have to drop out completely. They have to become the perfect subject. Which was impossible because there was always speculations that people had cell phones, and of course Frank Castle had a cell phone, and you never know what they were doing in the bathroom and the change room and so forth. But by and large, it was like sort of a very strange form of personal state of exception that was created, and it's very interesting that way. So I think what Fish Tank did on a higher level, and I know the intention of it probably wasn't that, because the intention was like, let's do it for the meme. And a lot of people, like I said, criticize Sammy and Jet Neptune for basically like psychologically torturing these people for the laughs of the audience. And then a lot of, like, without naming names, because I don't want to get into drama, there were certain people that even criticized Sam for not doing quote-unquote edgier content that he used to do, and why is he wasting his time on this? And even Sam would shy away from the more politically driven content at MD, to which, and again, without naming names, to which I would say that the reason he did is because it was Jet Neptune's, Fish Tank, as much as the ideas were already there, I from what I can gather, it was Jet Neptune's baby. He was the one that was there every single day. He was the one that made this happen. And I think that, I followed it all the way to the end. I was there in the audience when I saw Jet go up to the main bedroom, which is bedroom 4, I believe. Yeah, the one with the big bed that got trashed. And he was just there, and he just breathed a sigh of relief before the camera shut off. And he, it was this incredibly beautiful moment because all of his work paid off. And despite all of the setbacks, and apparently, like, even behind the scenes that he revealed later that could have been a catastrophe, such as the plumbing backing up, despite everything, he devoted his life for 6 weeks, even before then, to do this, to cultivate the perfect the holy internet-based spectacle. And I think, like, when Jet was there and he was just sighing relief and he was laying on the bed frame, and it was a beautiful moment. It was a beautiful moment. And yeah, so I think the reason Sam Hyde shied away from the explicit political content, apart from like, people were dropping hard R's, people were dropping meme references, all that. Like they did, like Sam got rid of the whole like notion that this was like an explicitly political form of performance art or performance comedy. Like by like this is basically an MD skit. No, no, he had to do that for a reason. It was Jet Neptune's project, and it was apart from the norm, and certain people couldn't understand that because of a lot of people that are in the political commentary community are Philistines. So they don't really recognize when people are trying to do something different, right? And I understand we're all in this fight and all that. I understand that. But sometimes you just need to do things that, birth an idea into existence. And you could say that it was a grift or it lacked a political message, therefore it's worthless. And I personally believe that people on both sides of that criticize works of art or even like works of entertainment. I mean, yeah, most entertainment is trash and vacuous. And one can make the argument that Fish Tank was vacuous. But I do believe that, you have to really look at the accomplishment of this. That it truly is a media production that is wholly of the internet. That is not being influenced by the outside. And sometimes you have to bracket those criticisms. It's either a grift operation or it's not political enough. Because God forbid, that people stray from the message. I think every act is political, and you could even read a politics into Fish Tank. You could even say that, yes, this is a dissident performance thing, and it's an irreverence for, like, the psychological norms of people, and you could say that it's inherently Psalmistot and disruptive, like every single thing that the MD Extended Universe has done. But at the end of the day, I mean, it doesn't have an explicit level of politics. And you can even argue that a lot of MDE skits did. I mean, yes, they had a dissident vibe. Some of them even more explicitly so. A lot of them. But there were other ones that didn't have that were just critiquing the absurdities of the life that we're living in right now. That didn't have to, like, lend itself to a quote-unquote dissident politics. Right? And I know that just by virtue of Sam Hyde and his relation to different political figures and movements, that sort of criticism is tainted. Because, now when you've been targeted as, like, a person of the right nowadays by the media, which, I mean, Sam Hyde is, and you can't shy away from it, obviously. Or at least maybe not explicitly as so as before, that, you can't do anything else, that every little bit of your work will have a dog whistle. That people could even, like, I guarantee you could probably dig up some Daily Dot article or whatever that could say that even Fish Tank is like a grand dog whistle. Right? I mean, I've looked, but you could find that. So yeah, and I think like the relation to space, the relation to the outside and the in, the relation to how we view ourselves and how we even enjoy viewing ourselves. Like, that was something that Fish Tank provided that other things could not. Finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about Airsoft Fatty. And I think that something I alluded to in tweets, but, like, I had this one comment on a clip channel on Fish Tank about the way that, like, Letty was kind of correct about John and Chris, how they either hide behind poverty or religion or neurodivergency or obesity, disability, to mask the way that they are doing, like, objectively terrible behavior. Now, let me preface this by saying, as a fellow fat guy, I wish nothing but the best for Chris, and I hope that Sam and the boys and Jet and the MD universe can, like, take Airsoft Fatty under their wings and truly make him into a content beast to the point where he can make regular income. Because I think that, they could get him to do readings. But I noticed that, like, I kind of feel bad for talking this way about someone. But I noticed that I can see certain tendencies that I possess just by nature of by nature of being a fat guy who is a bit more gregarious, but who's a bit socially awkward, and who, let's face it, has problems with their own sense of body image, has problems with their own sense of, actuality, if you know what I mean, for YouTube. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, but, who has problems in the romance department. I noticed that, like, Chris would use humor or try to be nice to people to diffuse certain situations. And, there's clearly that he's got some, other problems besides just obesity. And, I saw that because it's like, I'm sympathetic to it because I not that I'm like that, but even just saying that's kind of belittling him, but saying like, oh, I'm not like that. I'm not that bad. But I do notice that there is a universal trait with fat guys that there is a level by which you approach the social as being as sort of friendly and deferential as possible and being self-deprecating to diffuse criticism. But then when that interest is not reciprocated, it takes a lot of effort to not feel down on yourself and to not lash out on others. And there were moments where Chris, he lashed out at Letty and so forth, and he would insult her. And so, I'm not condoning that at all. Like, I think that it's a very, like, I know it's a spectacle, and I know people want this, and I know people, like, they're egging him on, and they're egging Letty on, and it's a big joke. But I think the real human relation is that, from a woman's perspective, it is kind of terrible to live with someone that, that he's fantasizing about you in a certain way, and he can't take no for an answer, and then it becomes awkward. Then his, like, sort of attempt to get in your pants by being nice to you then turns into bitterness and turns into rage and turns into insult. I know, like, from a woman's perspective, I can understand that's genuinely creepy and terrible. But I think that with Chris, his character arc was very interesting. And even just using the term character arc, because these are supposedly, a real life sort of cinema verita style expose on people's real lives. So to say character is kind of like, it's removing the reality of it. But, Chris flying into rage, of course, he's probably got problems and you can't really blame him. But when you're at that level, it's very difficult to separate those emotions. And I think that's why Chris was a tragic figure, in a way, in Fish Tank. Because it's clear that he was attracted to Letty, obviously. But, then going from wishing and hoping to scorn, but not being able to contain that. Like, there were certain moments I couldn't watch. Because not just like, oh, I see, because you're a fetish, so you could see, you were probably in that situation. It's like, okay, without blowing my spot. I think, like, there were certain moments I couldn't see because I know the emotions he was probably going through. I know the dynamic that was there. And I know it's unfair. And in these human relations, especially between men and women, I know they can be incredibly harsh and unfair. But it was almost painful to watch. Those, and like, okay, all the things with Frank Castle coming in, destroying things, and with Mario and whatever, all the times that, like, Sylvia freaked out, all the times that John would explode and he was annoying, and, like, he would, like, do absolutely crazy things, like when they had the laser tag. No, it wasn't laser tag, it was the Nerf tag thing. Whereas, like, Storm the Cat, like, King of the Mountain Nerf tag, where he was like, we're gonna F up the babies. Like, that was crazy. That moment was generally screwed up. But, no, the only time I was really uncomfortable was with the segments where the days, see, segments, there you go. You're using media language of a series to talk about real life, which is kind of disturbing. But the days in which Chris and Letty would go at it, or Chris and Sylvia, it's like it was hard to watch because I could intuit those emotions. And I really do feel bad. And I think that, if Airsoft Fatty works on himself and he cultivates himself, then, something could happen. But I think that there's always a dance around, like, you're really nice, but, it's like, yeah. It's like, these are very terrible dynamics. and they're never going to get solved. And I think like the whole like discourse around like rad femmes versus pickup artists and red pilled people, and you know, the E-right and the rad femmes and all these discourse around attractiveness and dating and all this coal, this Vanta black coal that people in the E-right are obsessed with on the internet, but people in general, right? Even beyond the E-right, even normies are obsessed with this type of like, you know, like Pearly and Andrew Tate versus whatever, like that was podcast with the E-girls, and they you know have their slow IQ takes, but it's always about men versus, it's always gender wars, it's always dating, it's coal, it's Vanta black coal. But all of those issues, the reason they will never be resolved is because they're dealing with very nuanced human relations that are unguarded by social institutions and mechanisms and civilizational rituals that were there to guide younger people into, you know, the higher considerations of why they go with certain people over others. And, you know, I think like a lot of these things miss the point. A lot of these points of discourse miss the point. But I was very captivated when Airsoft Fatty joined the Fish Tank, because the dynamics were there, and it's like, you know, you feel bad for him, but yet he does very bad behavior, and he's struggling. And there's the dynamic between like, you know, less attractive men and women, especially fat people. And it's like, yeah, so these are very sticky relations, but at the same time, I think that there were moments where Airsoft Fatty, you know, Chris, there were beautiful moments. There were moments where, you know, he got along with people. There were moments like at the very end where he was like defending Josie and Letty. And I thought him and Sam were going to come to blows, but because I was, you know, everyone in the chat even said was worried that, you know, that Chris wasn't in on the joke. He kind of went over his head, but you know, he took it like a man. And I think that even like Frank Castle defending Chris against Mario, that one live stream or whatever, Instagram live, where it's like, you know, you're basically picking on someone who doesn't have the mental faculties to get every single nuance of social interaction. But yeah, so I think Fish Tank, to wrap this up, in the paywalled version of this, will have an extra hour of content where I talk about various geopolitical events and various hot takes. So please subscribe for that. I just wanted to gather all of the various random thoughts and communiques and so forth that I had about Fish Tank, and to try and see a bit of the higher element in it. Whether this is just baseless word selling and this is like just wasting your time over something that's just memes is debatable. But thank you all for joining, and I'll see you on the other side. As always, God bless, goodbye, like, share, subscribe to Patreon or the Substack if you don't like Patreon. Yeah. Thank you for listening to the Content Minded Podcast, where every Wednesday there are interesting guests, amazing ideas, solo streams, and discussions on a diverse array of topics from art, philosophy, history, and more. The free version will be available both here on YouTube and as a downloadable link on Anchor and Spotify, as well as on Substack. Each week, the full, uncensored, and spicier version will now be available on both Patreon and Substack, where you will have access to the full archive of both Content Minded and of Giant Reviews, where I break down interesting texts every week, including other exciting paywalled articles and good content. Thank you all. Please like, share, and subscribe. God bless. Goodbye. Help keep the content renaissance alive. Too sweet.